We
Well,
are ready.
Yeah, well, I want to say good morning again to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of my views on current and past events.
We'd like to do a bit of an introduction for all of our viewers, I think.
Well, I'm T. Williams, and I've been around for in Minnesota since 1965. Moved here with my family at that time, just my oldest son, Chris, who's a pediatrician here now. And after we moved here, we had two other children, all of whom are grown, all of whom went through Minneapolis Public Schools. I had no intentions of coming to Minnesota. I was recruited to come here to work at a settlement house that no longer exists called Unity House. And I was there. My goal, my longer term goal was to do what John Adams did for 40 years. I was interested in academics, and so my plan was to go back to graduate school and get my PhD and land up at a university somewhere east of the Mississippi, because my wife is from Philadelphia. We were living in Chicago. She couldn't stand Chicago. She wanted to get out of Chicago. And I met her in graduate school when I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and I was able to have my graduate education completely paid for. I went there on a fellowship from the Cook County Public Welfare Department. My background was in social work, and they wanted their caseworkers to earn graduate degrees. And so those of us who qualified could get this fellowship, which was federal funds given to the state, and we could go to the university, college, the university of our choice. And I chose the University of Pennsylvania. They paid my airfare. They paid my fare out. At that time, they wouldn't pay for air. I had to ride the bus out, and though they paid all of my academic fees and tuition, and my returning trip back. And in addition to that, they gave me $300 a month to live on. In 1960, $300 was very meaningful. I was able to secure a place in Philadelphia. I was even able to save money on that. So I met my wife, who was whom I sat next to in class. And at that time, I was a smoker, and you could smoke in class then. And I blew smoke in her face, and she couldn't stand me. Eventually, we reconciled that, but we were married on the same day that our graduation occurred. Our graduation occurred 2 days. Let's see, 3 days. We were married on a Saturday, graduation on that Monday, and moved to Chicago. And I was required to give back to the county 2 years of my time. And when that was up, I was looking for employment that would take me back east. Instead, I got a telephone call from someone here in Minneapolis, invited me up for an interview. I came up and I interviewed, and I came back and told my wife, I like the city, people live in houses there. We were on the 11th floor in an apartment complex, large apartment complex. And I said, what do we do if I get the job offer? I said, because I think I interviewed well. And she said, well, why don't we, let's see what happens. And I got the job offer, and she said, let's take it because it's getting us out of Chicago. And so we came to Minneapolis. We knew one person here, a fellow by the name of Ashby Gaskins, who who recruited me. And he learned about me through a classmate of mine from the University of Illinois. There's something of this, where I've always believed in networking. And so we ended up here, and I said, my goal, and I told my employer, I said, look, I can only commit for 2 years, because she was aware of my long-term goals, but she was willing to take a risk on me. And so we came here, and at the end of the summer, because I spent that at the summer camp, I had already begun to research how to get out. And when I was contacted by a board member, Phyllis Wheatley, woman named Min Himmelman. Some of you might know her as Art Himmelman's mother. And I'd never known her, I never heard of her before. And she invited my wife and I to her home for lunch. And I didn't know why. And we got there, and there were these three women, what I call the stereotype of Black and Jewish mothers. That they, when I went in, I had nothing to say. They told me why they wanted me here, and they sat me down and they gave me a talking to. Then they told me they wanted me to become the next executive of Phyllis Wheatley, because Henry Thomas, who was executive, had gone over to St. Paul to Hallie Q. Brown. And I said, I can't do that because I made a commitment. They said, we've already talked to her. That was my boss at Unity House was a woman named Elsa Weinlich. Said, we've talked to her and she's excited about this opportunity for you. And I said, I still can't apply, but I tell you what, if you send me a letter inviting me to come for an interview, I will come, and if you want to get information about me, talk to my wife. And that's essentially what they did. And I became the executive at Phyllis Wheatley, and that changed all of my plans for leaving in 2 years, because I was scoping out universities I was going to, probably back to the University of Pennsylvania. And there I was. And I was here, and that was in 1960. That was in October '65. Well, those of you who are old enough around out there, you know what happened in 1966. Tom certainly knows that we had this small disturbance up on Plymouth Avenue, which really gave birth to an organization called The Way. And I was at Phyllis Wheatley at the time, and there were gatherings all around the Northside, and that was some new leadership came out of that happening. Well, '66, we then soon morphed into 1967, where the disturbance was much larger, and so by then I knew that we were probably going to be here, and so I went driving through the North Side. We were living in an apartment on Olson Highway in Humboldt. And I went for a drive one day over in the neighborhood where we live now, which is the Willard Homewood area, and so we found a house, and we have been in this one place since 1967. The part of my introduction there is also a part of my presentation. So I decided that I wanted an opportunity to share some of my thinking about these things with others. So I sat down one day and I began to think about what were some of the similarities and differences between where we are now and where we were then. And there are some significant differences and similarities, but my focus was, well, let me go back and say, since 2012, I've been working on what started out as an oral history project. And what got me started on that, I was concerned about what was happening to some of the history from the 60s, around 66, 67, and so on, and the startup of the Urban Coalition, because these people were old. Some of them were old when all this got started and had grown older, and some of them were permanently gone. And there was no real history of that. And I said, it would be great to talk to some of these people and at least get some of that on record. And so I submitted an application to the Historical Society. And it really was something that I thought about doing when I was at the Humphrey Institute, but I didn't. When I went over to Humphrey, I really didn't know, how to go at some of this stuff. And I think the time that I spent there, I gathered enough knowledge and information to know how to write grants, because I went to the Humphrey Institute as a senior fellow, and Lee in particular is familiar with this. If you're a senior fellow at the Humphrey Institute, you are truly carrying your own weight. You're paying for what you do. And so you're raising a whole lot of money to support your projects. And I didn't know how to do that before I went to the Humphrey, and hanging out around the people over there, I learned how to get some of that stuff done. And so my strategy then is that I wanted to do particularly an oral history of the urban coalition, because most of those founders then, the 14 of them, were still with us. But my idea of what I wanted to do was beyond my capacity to do it. I wanted to do a video documentary, and I'd never done anything like that. I've only heard about it. So and no one wanted to give me money for that, and I don't blame them. It would have been wasted money, although I was able to raise some money to do some other things related to that. But what happened was that where we are now, particularly when this thing happened with, first with Jamal Clark, is what got me moving in this direction. And a group at my church, Redeemer Lutheran, we had a Black Lives Matter group there, and had a lot of young people that gathered and were full of enthusiasm and wanted to get things done. And I had an opportunity to attend one of their meetings, and I saw, and they were really excited about getting stuff done, but I didn't like the particular mix of the group. That they were almost all young people. And I said, that's great and it's important, but you also need to reach out and bring some other people into the pack, because you want some people in here that might have some one or two views that are a little bit different from yours. And then you need to spend some time. If you think that what you're proposing is truly right and proper, then you can work with them and convince them that you have the solutions, but you must be prepared for people to challenge what you're proposing. And I said that you need to have as many voices, as many at the table as possible. Now, that was taken in, and I was usually on the fringe of it, the old man that they would allow to speak and would be courteous to listen, but didn't always follow through. And so I began to look at, I said, now, what is there about what happened almost 50 years ago when I started this that still holds true? And I know that when you're going through a crisis like the ones we are through now, and you we seldom think that what you're doing is making a difference. I said, wouldn't it be nice to take a look back at what was done in the late 1960s following the street violence, and see whether or not there's anything that we can point to now that made a difference. Because when I was active at that time, I often thought that what we were doing didn't make sense, and that what difference is it making? I didn't see things were not moving fast enough, and there was not enough change. But as I look back, I said, well, why don't I start by taking a look at what happened? I was not interested in trying to relive the violence itself, trying to describe and thinking about who was involved in it and what kind of property damage there was and so on. But what happened after the violence on Plymouth Avenue? Well, that was in 1960. It started in 66, and a group of people gathered on the north side, the organizations about that, and talking about what we need to do. And the focus was on, say, jobs for the young people, because we were blaming it all on the youth, that they were out in the streets. So if we can get them active and engaged, then we won't have this anymore. And but in 1967, we had it again, and it was more powerful then. Well, think about what was going on in the country in 1966, 67, 64, so on. There was a lot of activity, voting rights and the Vietnam protests and the whole thing. And Lyndon Johnson was the president. And thanks for putting that up there, Helen. And that one of the things that I'll follow my slides now, but and what I often start with here, and there's an old African proverb that's written on here that says, "Until the lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunters." So if you have to be able to tell your own story, because if you leave it to others to tell it, it's not your story, it's their story. Well, the crisis that I wanted to focus on here really began with the Civil Rights Act and Civil Rights and Voting Act of 64 and 65, and then the street violence throughout the 60s, really, particularly 65 to 1970. And Minneapolis was 66 and 67. And then the assassination of Dr. King and of Bobby Kennedy. And then I want to also talk about the riot at Attica prison, because you want to put the next one up, Helen. As I said, there was a national response to the crisis of the 60s. And Lyndon Johnson convened a group of civil rights and civic and business leaders. He invited them to Washington, and he invited them there to scold them, really, as Lyndon Johnson did as president, and told them to go back home and get something done. And there was an organization, a national urban coalition that had been formed at that time, and the former Secretary of Health and Welfare, Gardner, was heading that up. Well, and the focus, we recognized then that the issue that has always been front and center in this country on almost every encounter that we've had, race and poverty have been a part of it. There was the war on poverty, the Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and legislation that was established in 1964 that created the Office of Economic Opportunity, and it provided tremendous resources to communities like Minneapolis and other urban centers. You want to move on, and that I particularly want to talk now about how we responded locally. When Lyndon Johnson said, "Go back home and do something," well, Minneapolis did something, because when they came back, and again, we were talking earlier before we started, it really depends a lot on the leadership. And there needs to be at least 1, 2, or 3 people who are willing to take some risk and go out to see what they can get done. Well, Arden Afflin was always, talking about these issues, and he was agitating among people who had assets and resources. And what happened, that was John Coles Jr. was the key person in the business community that really moved this whole thing forward, because he talked to his colleagues, and he had access to them. He could talk to the Daytons and the rest of them, and encourage them that they needed to do something. But these were people that were not interested in any publicity. They didn't want their names connected with anything. They really didn't fully understand what was going on. Couldn't understand why in Minneapolis, which was not in the Deep South, that people would, that their nice Black people would raise up in arms. And so what they did was to create this steering committee that represented major corporate institutions. And as you may recall then, all 5 of the Dayton brothers were still with us. And that not much got done in Minneapolis at that time that didn't have their stamp on it. And at the time, the Nicollet Mall was sort of a creation of the Daytons. And there were, you knew who they were through that, mostly through the civic work that they were doing. And those establishment institutions, you didn't know who they were in relation to institutions serving poor people or serving people of color, because they didn't know anything about those communities. Well, they wanted to do something and didn't quite know what to do. And so it was the initial approach was that you go to who you know. And those people in that circle didn't know any Black people besides Cecil Newman. And so they, Art Naftalin steered them to a fellow named Larry Harris. Larry is no longer with us, but Larry worked in North Minneapolis for a while before he went to Minneapolis Public Schools. And I had an opportunity to work with Larry. And they wanted to engage Larry to do a study, what they call a feasibility study, about the feasibility of creating an urban coalition. Now, Larry was smart enough to say to them, what's it going to look like if a group of rich white men hire another white man to go into the minority community to talk about what needs to be done to help that group? It's not going to have any credibility, And so Larry was said that he couldn't do this by himself, and that he would do it if he could get someone from that community to work with him. Well, what had happened, and all of this I was unaware of until afterwards, but I'd had a visit from John Coles Jr. At Phyllis Wheatley, and he called me up and asked to come out to talk to me. And I said, yeah, come on out. But then I wondered, what's this rich white man wanted to come out and talk to me about? I didn't know. I knew who he was, but I didn't know him. But he came out and we had a good conversation together. And it was shortly after that when Larry called me and told me about what they wanted to do and asked me if I would be willing to work with him and we would be co-partners in this. And I would remain at Phyllis Wheatley. This would be an extra gig I would take on. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll do it, but I need to meet with the group and talk to, be a part of the two of us talking to them about what it is that they thought they wanted us to do. And we did that. And a couple of things that we said to them is that, let's not call this a study. I said, because I'm not gonna go out, particularly in the Black community, talking about people, a group of white men paying for us to do a study. That's not gonna get us anywhere. And so we said that we need to have an upfront commitment, at least to the two of us, that you're gonna do something. And what you're engaging us to do is to help you discover what that something that you want to do ought to look like. And that we would then go out into the community and talk about that, talk about your commitment, and that you want to do something that you're really going to hang in there. And we will help you design what it should look like. And the other thing we said is that if you start on this, whatever we create here, you can't back away. And you've got to hang with it. So we recommended the creation of the Urban Coalition because we said to this group of 14 is that, and you have to be highly visible in it because the people we come from don't know who you are, they don't trust you, they trust the government more than they trust you. And that you've never engaged with them before. They don't see you in their daily lives because you are not in the places where they go. You're not at their churches. You don't live in their neighborhood. They don't go to country clubs. They don't play golf and the like. So where have they had an opportunity to meet you? And so what we said is that you need an organization that's going to be large enough that we can have this broad representation around the table. So we designed this organization. Who in their right mind would design an organization with the board of directors of 60 people that eventually grew to be about 100? But what we really were talking about doing was creating a network that ordinary people could plug into. And that this was a forum, so that the board meetings became forums, and the actual work got done in task forces. And that so it created the opportunity so that a welfare rights mother could be seated next to Steve Keating, CEO at Honeywell, and they could tell one another their own stories. And if they connected and there was something beyond that didn't happen around that table happened, then so much the better. So a lot of networking took place there. And so that the board, what we said also is that you have to be prepared in these board meetings to be vilified, because no one is going to thank you for what you're doing. And in fact, they're going to question your motive. And so all kinds of, I'm sure Tom and some others around here may who attended in those meetings. So it was not unusual that Dennis Banks and Matt Eubanks and Spike and some of the others would come into the meetings and would take them over and misdirect them. And we said that you cannot, regardless of how angry and upset you are, you got to hang in there. And what you do is discern something that you can take away from that you can then take back elsewhere and work on it. So organizations that grew out of that kind of debate around that table, it's an organization that is, you want to move the next slide. These are some of what I call the legacies of the street violence and the urban coalition. The major corporations began to change recruitment, promotion, and hiring practice. At that time, there were very few, if any, top-level managers in those major corporations. The way became grew out of the violence. And what was important about organizations, institutions like the Way, not so much, you have to look past the rhetoric that is often very hyperbole, and think about, now is he saying something that that has some value to it, and can I just pull that out of there without getting caught up in all of the other rhetoric that he's saying, and can I then go away with that and get something done? I think the thing that I always ask people to think about is that protest is essential, because there's not because that's a form of conflict, and conflict drives change. But sometimes we confuse and expect more out of the protesters than they're capable of delivering. The role of the protesters is to highlight the conflict and highlight what the issues and the problems are. Do not expect them to offer solutions and then work toward creating those solutions. There must be others who are around to take advantage of that, and that we should never allow a conflict to go by that we do not look for opportunities to advance something of value from it. But so that the Way, and then there's an organization that the Summit Academy now, which is one of the most substantial institutions that we have in helping people of color and poor people move up in the labor market, called Summit Academy OIC. Well, that started as TCOIC, and there was a person around at that time, Tom will remember this, called Stan King. And he was a black Baptist type minister that fashioned himself really to be another Martin Luther King. They had the same King name. But they brought an idea from Philadelphia here called the Opportunities for Industrialization Centers and developed that. And over time, that has morphed into an institution that now is very substantial. But it grew out of the violence, the street violence. That's one of it. And then Pilot City, North Point Wellness Center was established in 1966. That also is a legacy of the violence and people being in position to take advantage of those opportunities. Conflict always creates opportunities if we are able to take advantage of it. Control data for a while had a manufacturing plant in North Minneapolis. I was executive at Phyllis Wheatley and was directly involved in helping them secure the site that they had because they were interested in another site that the neighborhood didn't want them to have. And Minneapolis Public Schools was closing one of their school buildings. And we convened at Phyllis Wheatley and made that happen. The American Indian AIM were started in 1968 with support of the Urban Coalition. Now that wasn't advertised, but they were able to do that because Dennis Banks and the name is slipping now, but a couple of the people there were on the Urban Coalition board, and they were able to connect with the people there with the resources, and they were able to secure the resources they need to start AIM. GIMIC, the Greater Metropolitan Housing Corporation, an outgrowth of the Urban Coalition. The Legal Rights Center was started because Doug Hall and Phil and Sil Davis and Gwen Jones Davis and a couple of others were getting his name down from AIM were together with Peter Dorsey, who was on the Urban Coalition board, and they were able to start that. Now, perhaps the premier institution that grew out of the Urban Coalition is META, which is still around and recently received a significant grant to help minority businesses. And a program called Operation De Novo, which was established in 1970, a pretrial diversion program. And Project Pride and Living. Now, what happened there that I don't know whether Joe Savaggio was able to join us this morning or not, but Joe was a priest at the time and was on one of the board members of the Urban Coalition. And it put him into that network of the corporations and where there were ample resources available. Now, he would not have been able to meet those people as a priest of a small Southside parish. He didn't have membership to the Minneapolis Club. He didn't go hang out at Minnetonka Golf Club, and they were not members of his parish. So where else could they meet? Well, one of the places they could meet was around the table of the Urban Coalition at their meetings, and many of them did. You want to move the next one, Helen? Now, there was some, right now there were some responses from religious institutions because they held membership on the board. This was a broad-based organization with membership. And the American Lutheran Church at that time, which was my church, they launched the program initiative there. Well, one of their sort of what I call maybe failed project was Project Summer Hope. They were going to wipe out racism over one summer. And a group of us went down and had conversations with the bishop and others and tell them, you know, they're great, applauded them for thinking in that direction, but chided them on their naivete about their understanding of racism, that it could be dealt with in a summer. But what grew out of that was a minority scholarship and grants program. So think about what it is that you can do. what assets that you have that you can make available? Well, they had educational institutions that were almost 100% white. How can you make those institutions available to students of color? And they created a minority scholarships and grant program in 1970, and they were wise enough to appoint me as the chair of that committee, and I served as its chair until it ended with the merger of and the creation of the ELCA. So those are what I cite all of this because these really are responses to the crisis, and the responses came about because of, I think, the strategic location of people within those institutions that were open to change. Didn't always know how to move forward with it, but were at least open to it and were willing to consult with people who might have some ideas about it. You want to go to the next one now, Kelly? Now this is what do we learn from that? And this is what I learned. I don't know whether any of the rest of you would discern this from all of that or not. But value and inclusive process. You really have to have different kinds of people with different kinds of ideas around the table. So find seats at the table for all who want to be a part of the solution. If you're interested in solving a problem, become a part of that. Consult with someone, talk with someone about it. You may not have the idea, and they may not necessarily have it, but collectively, I think you're able to discern something from it. And remember, and this is the point I made earlier about protest. We're going to have that. We always have had it. Don't try to get rid of it. Understand it and find out how you can learn from it. And so the dissatisfaction drives change, and confrontation can be a useful tool. Learn and understand it. And the thing that we often don't do is use our existing resources to the fullest. And what was available to I think we had, in many ways, we had more readily available resources during those times than we necessarily have now. One major resource that was available to poor people, and there was a lot of manure that went with this, but it was available. And that was the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson, the War on Poverty, the Office of Economic Opportunity. The thing that they brought to the table that is valued and is making possible a lot of the protests that's going on and organizing going on now is that they brought that in order to qualify for those resources, the institutions had to be able to establish that they had resident participation in it. That so if you submitted a proposal to OEO for funding, you need to show that the people who are going to benefit from this played a role in helping to create it. And that was a way to increase the civic engagement. And then networking is a critical tool. And that's what the Urban Coalition was. It's a giant network, beyond the institution that may have helped to establish. There are many individuals that sat around that table that got to know one another. That was that cross pollination that was taking place across racial and economic lines. Where does that exist today? It really doesn't. And that's where, the African American Leadership Forum and its alliances for alliances, I'm going to become more familiar with it. But if nothing else, it can create those networks that allow people who have never been into those kinds of situations to have access to assets and to individuals. And sometimes what is more important is to have access to someone who knows something than having someone give you a whole pile of money. And here, patience. I think so many of us don't have the patience. That's what concerns me about a lot of what is happening now. Patience is more than a virtue. We always say patience is a virtue. It's more than a virtue. It's a necessity. Change can be slow and tedious process, especially if it is to be sustained. And then finally it said, know the difference between the capacity to confront and the capacity to implement and respect it. Now, that's one final thing I want to say, and then we can talk about it. There's one whole piece I have not mentioned as this other crisis that I had on my list was Attica prison. When in 1971, that place blew up, 40 plus people lost their lives. Well, Attica is a long ways from Minnesota, but because it was in an institution that exists in Minnesota, prison, it had its impact. And fortunately, Minnesota, at least at that time, I saw when we came to Minnesota, one of the things that I observed from time to time to some of my friends was that I saw it, at least in the public side of it, I saw Minnesota as a can-do type of state, and that it was open to experimentation, and it was strong on social justice type issues, and that there was good communications among its public leaders. They talked to one another. They disagreed, but they talked to one another. And so when that violence occurred out in Attica, and Wendy Anderson was governor, and he had as his commissioner a person there. His name it'll come to me in a minute, but the commissioner came here from California, and he was open to. He brought a lot of ideas here. Some of them crazy, some of them very good. And one of them was the idea of an ombudsman, and he convinced Governor Anderson that one of the ways that Minnesota could deal with the impending crisis in its prison was to create a Scandinavian type ombudsman. That is someone that would be independent of the system, but had the authority to investigate complaints. Well, when they bought it, because they did it because of, as I was talking before, there were resources available that not available now. I don't see our ability to get a grant from the Justice Department now to start an operation like the Minnesota Ombudsman for Correction, but that grant came out of the Justice Department at that particular time. And so that no one here really knew anything about it. And so it was created by executive order, and I was named to be Minnesota's first ombudsman for correction. And it was an operation without any authority. Its only authority was to investigate. And what, if it was going to work, it was going to be really up to the person that was there to implement that office, so that I had to find a way to make it work. And I couldn't do that by myself, so I had to find some people to take there with me that could help make it work. And so that brings together again back to this whole idea of networks, because I needed to have a person that would help us get a bill through the legislature. And the only way I was going to do that was to have someone that could spend some time over there and who also understood that process better than I did. And my friend at Control Data, Norberg, whom I'd gotten to know when they were establishing the plan in North Minneapolis, had someone that was recently promoted to a vice president position, and they had needed about 6 months to get him set up. And he asked me if I would like to have this person work for me full time. And he was fully under my leadership, and I could assign him however I chose to. And I accepted, and he became my legislative liaison. Now that meant he knew some of the legislators. Well, the second thing that needed to happen in order for this thing people to have any kind of belief in it, we had to be doing something. And there was only two of us, myself and a deputy. And that wasn't going to do it. I need to have more staff. So again, I go back to my trusted network. In 1970, I had been awarded a Bush Fellowship, Leaders Fellowship, Humphrey Dorman was president of the foundation at the time. And after I completed my fellowship and I was in the Ombudsman's office, I contacted Humphrey and I said, we need some help here. And I said, no, private foundations do not like to fund public institutions. At that time, they were very reluctant to do that. And so I had to convince Humphrey that they should consider accepting an application from me for the state of Minnesota, and that it would be dedicated to this program. And we need to do it in such a way that it could not be perceived that they were trying to influence any legislation. And so I was assigned a program officer over there, a woman by the name of Emily Galusha. And again, which goes back to this whole thing of networking, because I had served on a special commission to investigate the takeover of Morrill Hall at the University of Minnesota in 1969. And one of the people on there was a fellow by the name of Hugh Galusha, who at that time was president of the Federal Reserve. Well, Emily was Hugh's daughter. And so now I'm here that Emily is a program officer at the Bush Foundation. And I had gotten to know Hugh through being a Bush fellow. And I know and that they were going to, that's an important connection because I was not competing against any other applicants for funding for this project. That what I had to do was to convince the foundation that they were investing in something here, and that they were also, and Humphrey was the kind of person who also believed in investing in individuals. And so I was successful in getting the Bush Foundation to grant to the state of Minnesota, dedicated to the Office of Ombudsman, a grant in 1973 for $135,000. That enabled me to hire staff, that we were able then to launch the Office of Ombudsman for Corrections and deal with crises that were coming up there, to the extent that, and with the help of the person that I now had in the as a legislative liaison, we were successful in getting the state legislature to pass a bill creating the Office of Ombudsman for Corrections in 1973. And it lasted 30 years. And then the cycle begins again. And and this will end my talking here. I participated with a group that helped get that office reestablished after it had been away for 16 years. Well, what I hope that what I'm trying to convey here was that the value of networking, and important to have the right people in place, and that it's do not forget what we have done in the past and how we can connect it to where we are now. And let us always look for opportunities to learn from our mistakes and to learn from history. And I don't see enough of people, trying to discern those kinds of things from our past experiences, almost as if we never experienced this before. And we have to start from scratch. And we've been through this time after time after time, and we're gonna go through it again and again and again. So let's think about how we can learn from where we've been to help us decide where we're going. So that's enough of my rambling. So,
not at all, T. Thank you so much. That was a really good presentation. Lyndon. I see Lyndon's hand is up.
You're on mute.
There, I know I'm unmuted.
Yep.
I was wondering if Mr. Williams could comment about the role of the Minneapolis Public Schools during that period of time. You referenced, for example, the work with the Urban Coalition of Larry Harris. And I know he was later with the Minneapolis schools and heavily involved. And that would have been probably during the administration of John B. Davis Jr. and later people like Dr. Richard Green. But I do know that they were involved at certain levels, and if you could maybe comment a bit about their role.
Yeah, well, one of I think the really constructive things about the Urban Coalition at that time is that those major institutions were represented on the board of the Urban Coalition. John B. Davis was a board member, and he would attend meetings or send someone to represent him. The other thing about the Urban Coalition that I think was important was that there was a requirement during its first cycle of years that the president of the board of the organization had to come from the corporations that what I call the founding corporations. It had to be either the CEO or someone who reported directly to them. And then they tried to maintain that over time, but the reason for that was that you wanted people there, so when you talked about dealing with certain critical issues, that the person who is instrumental in the decision-making process at these organizations was at the table and could take it back. Well, a lot of things got done there that was done through the network of the Urban Coalition, more so than it coming out as a formal project of the Urban Coalition. And that is how it truly was, I think, particularly on the educational side of it, is that there were oftentimes that the Minneapolis Public School was interested in a particular issue or program that was facilitated by its relationship to someone in that Urban Coalition network. And that I talked about the legacies of the coalition, that there were a number of those that I cited that grew out of task forces where there was specific recommendation, and the coalition as an institution took action on it. But there were many, many more things that took place that grew out of the Urban Coalition network, the individuals around that table who were connected. For example, the changes in the recruitment and hiring practices of those corporations. You know, that was never an action by the Urban Coalition as an institution that addressed that. But what was put before every one of those executives that were on the table, that they should go back and do an internal examination of what their hires looked like. And so much so that General Mills decided that they were going to hire their first Black vice president. And they designated that this was a set aside position. Well, that was how it was being done then. And so that you think that, well, the first thing that would jump out at you is this is really tokenism and it's for show. And it looked like that because General Mills, you could tell the title of the position is that they were going to hire a vice president for social action. You know, a major marketing company dealing in food and so on. You know, how do you relate that to their product? You know, and you know what you're related to is that they seem to be under pressure to hire someone Black, and they're going to do it. And so when they looked internally to try to find someone, there was no one ready to be promoted. You know, they would have had to go about 3-4 levels down, and that would have created internal conflict. And so they had to go outside. And well, they weren't clear as to what that, all they did, they wanted to know, they wanted to have that person in there. And so they then began to recruit, and they were focusing locally. They probably invited in every Black professional that they knew, there's a handful of us, to talk to about it, and could not tell them what that person, you know, it's your job, you make out of it what you can. And so I had just become ombudsman. This was in July, and this was in October. And they insisted that I come out for an interview. And so I went out and I spent the whole day out there. And I decided to go not because I wanted the job, but I decided to go because I wanted to influence who got the job. And so I went out, and I spent the whole day out there, and I talked to all the top executives, and ended up in Jim Summers' office at the end of the day and tell him that, gosh, you know, I appreciate what you guys are trying to do, but I don't think it's going to work because I truly don't believe that you're really into it. I said, if you were, you wouldn't be, first of all, you wouldn't have called this vice president for social action. And then you wouldn't be interviewing people like me. Because, you know, what do I bring to that? My background is in social work, primarily, you know, social action. And that, how does social action fit into a marketing company and so on? And I said, well, if you're sincere, because you need to have someone that's going to last longer than the position, because the position is not going to last. As soon as you have a change in administration at the corporation, the person coming in, I know I'd get rid of that position, not necessarily the person, but the position. I would check in with the person, see what that person knows how to do that fits what we do at the corporation. And so, and I said to them that the other thing is that you need to make sure that you have someone reporting to this person that's a part of what you do, making you like that for your products or your services to have some value, some financial value. And so I finally said that if you're really truly about this, you don't consider me as a hire, but I do have someone I'd like for you to consider. And it was my college roommate from the University of Illinois who had a master's in economics and was a manager in the Illinois Bell Telephone Company in Chicago. And he even looked like a corporate executive. He was tall and wore suits and wingtip shoes and so on. And so they ended up hiring him. And sure enough, one of the things that they did though, that they had reason to purchase Stevens Square, and they put that in his portfolio when he came, so that he had something that a product that he was responsible for. Well, they hired him, and he was there with them until he retired. And sure enough, they eliminated that position. He became corporate director, they called it personnel at the time. He served in that capacity for a while. And then when he ended up, he was the senior vice president there in charge of all of the properties of the corporation and their security. Now, I couldn't have done that they would have paid me. They probably would have kept me there and paid me until retirement, but I wouldn't have been doing anything, you know, of value to the corporation. it been great probably for me and for my financial situation, but that's about it. And but they did that, and so other corporations and Steve Keating from Honeywell said that he learned more in that 1 year that he was there about his business, because one of the things that he learned when he went into meetings at his company, he only saw white faces, and at that time he only saw white men, and that concerned him. And so it was that, to me, that was perhaps as great a value as the institution that they helped to create.
You're so full of information, but I want to make sure we get to some questions here. We have Janis and then Lee.
Okay, well, T, thank you. This has just been completely wonderful and invaluable. I've got a question partially my own and one that Tom Gilje, who couldn't be here today, sent in. He had said that today we're seeing the financial commitment of businesses, but are we really seeing the time commitment of their executives? And he compared this to what you've been talking about here in the 60s, that, you know, these executives of the businesses, mostly homegrown, were really fully engaged with the urban coalition in those early days. Can you kind of compare then to what's going on now in the sense of these business execs, and also tell us a little bit about what these 60-person meetings were like, where they were held. That's just fascinating.
They were held all over the city, and mostly in school auditoriums and that spaces that could seat more than 50 people. No, the people are not engaged now. That they are willing to invest their finances, but they are not nearly as willing to invest their time, because in some instances it's more valuable for me to have your presence there, because you bring more than money. You bring your body of knowledge, you know, there with whatever it is that we're doing. You know, you can give me a couple of $1 million and send it off to me, and said sometimes I might not always know how best to use that. You know, that I've got $1 million or $2 million that I've never had before. And I want to be able to invest it in such a way that it's going to help me improve upon what I'm doing. And if I'm doing this for the first time, you know, I don't always know what that looks like. But if you're willing to invest your time along with that, then you may have had some of those experiences that you can share with me. So I want you at the table as much as I want your money. In some instances, I might want you there more. And right now, I think that I've had a couple of, not recently, but about 8 or 10 years ago, I had an opportunity to have discussion with one or two of the people that's connected with the Attica group, and you know, but only with the staff. Now, what I wanted to do was to have some contact with the people, the body of it, those who to whom the staff reports, because I think there's a greater reluctance now to take risk, even than it was then. That particularly if you are not a part of the home scene, and people are, you know, more concerned about, I don't want it to appear that I'm trying to take over your operation, you know, and it is, if you've never been in this kind of environment before, it can be a little scary, because one of the things people are not going to be shy about calling you out. And if you can't take some criticism, you know, you really aren't going to do well. And that was the thing that we had to really work on this group about, is because you've never been in this kind of environment before, and you don't expect. They've been used to having people idolize them because they were these, you know, great corporate executives, and they were from these wonderful families, you know, and people always looked up to them. And here's someone coming in and say, I don't give a damn about who you are, your money or anything at all. And then so that they try to, that you react and then to what's right in front of you. And when you do that, then you lose out on an opportunity. And what we had to say is that sometimes someone said it to test you, simply to see how you react. And if you blow up, then they say, well, you're not for real in that. And that's an important, that was then, and I think it is now, but I see, I don't, well, I have to be careful, because I have to recognize that the times are different, and I'm completely from a different generation of these things, and I should not expect people to behave as I want them to, or as I perceive they would have back 50 years ago. But what I am concerned about is people to be shrewd enough to see if there are any takeaways from what happened then and what I might be saying, and then take it into your own system and run it through there, and it's going to come out different, but the value, it will take on some value if you allow it to sort of sift through your system.
Lee Munnich.
As you know, I grew up on the near north side, and my sister Roberta worked with you at Philadelphia for many years, or a few years anyway. And when I grew up there in the 50s and 60s, it was a very diverse community. There was a Jewish community, a Black community, Hispanic. It was one of the few areas of the city that didn't have, like the South Side, that didn't have covenants and redlining. And the 1967 events sort of, there were things leading up to it, but the 67 events led to essentially the Jewish community leaving the near north side, where they'd been for many years, and the synagogues were turned into other community buildings and that sort of thing. And there was a backlash that occurred to the kinds of things that Matt Eubanks and other of these young leaders that you referred to, Black leaders at the time, who were outspoken and led to the election of Charles Stenvig, and maybe some of the problems we have the police department today go back to the kind of leadership at that time in the police department, which still hasn't needs to be transformed. And the North Side has never really fully recovered from that period. What you talked about here is kind of the positive community leadership that was going on, but you also referred to the kind of the protest side of that. And sometimes they were more visible and ended up causing problems. Today, it's a different situation, but, the defund police has created, with some people and some of the ideas out there, as opposed to the sort of thing that you were doing with, working with the Black community and the businesses. So I'm wondering if there are some lessons about, the protests are needed in order to gain visibility, but on the other hand, they may drive away some people and the ability to kind of get the change you want. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, well, I think there are always going to be someone who's going to take issue with the protests and the protesters. But what I don't see is anyone, and maybe I don't see it because I'm not out there involved in it the way I once was, that there was, I know that when I was active and engaged, particularly in North Minneapolis, that I would, and I was observing the protests, that I was always looking for an opportunity to take advantage of the issues that were surfaced in these protests that turn that others might perceive as being highly charged or undesirable. Because if you didn't like what Matt Eubanks and Spike and some of the others were saying, and you got turned off, I could say the same thing and it would be more acceptable to you, primarily because of how I may have been saying it. So that I was then in a position to help move forward that idea that came out of that you thought to be so repugnant when it was being said by someone you didn't like, and someone that it's a little bit more acceptable to you, that it's a different kind of idea, and say, hey, maybe we can work together on that. There wasn't enough of that then, and there certainly is not enough of that now, that we aren't going to be able to say to the people the protesters that we don't like, okay, say to them that, don't use that voice, you just going to turn people off, and I think a lot of that myself when I hear someone that you're going to turn people off. But what I am hoping is that there are some people out there with the same ideas that will not turn people off, and that you can connect with them, or they know how to connect with you. And so part of what was happening then is that, and how we ended up, I think, being able to get Hennepin County to stay invested in North Point, which was then Pilot City, because they were always being criticized about what they were not doing. And so much of it was true, but it was the nature of the criticism and it's name calling that came in that affronted people. And there needed to be some people and some institutions available that believed in the same kinds of things and would push the same agenda, but would not push it in using different languages and metaphors and what have you, and accomplish really the same thing. And people will talk about and will be excited to work with you around it, and somehow that I don't know how much of it we're doing now is that the those whose voices are lower and softer have to stay connected also with those whose voices are louder, and you don't necessarily always have to be holding hands to do that, but the lines of communication truly have to be open. In that I had someone who worked for me for many years whose favorite saying was, there's more than enough for all of us to do out here if we disavow ourselves of being interested in claiming credit for it. So, doing the work without necessarily having people say that you are responsible for that getting done. If we're willing to work as a team and not care about who gets credit, but care about what gets done. And that's where I don't see enough of, and as I said, some of this is because I'm where I am, but I'd like to see some of that become a little bit more visible, that there is some interaction between those who voices are loudest and those who with the quiet voices, but who are actually doing the work. That the protesters are always going to protest. That we need them to voice what's going on, because they are more effective at doing that. I've never been the very effective at being the loud voice in the community and showing up at the protest meetings and having the press conferences and being the first one that the press will go to for phrases that they can say and use on TV.
Dana.
I'm going to ask another question that Clarence and Paul Gilje had set out there. It has to do with the record of educating disadvantaged youth of Minneapolis, which seems to be, as they put it, a quantum jump in seriousness compared with the 1960s. And you've said that education leaders by themselves can't do the job. It's a community job. Can you assess the problem and what action needs to be taken today?
Yeah, well, you know what, I served one term on the Minneapolis School Board, and when I went on, the reason why I ran for it was because I thought that those other school board members stuff wasn't getting done because you know they didn't know how to get it done. Just wait till I get on that school board, you know, that we're really gonna get stuff done. And I came on. I had plans and ideas about what to do, but the challenge is that, you know, the plans should not be. Do not elect a school board member because she or he has great plans for changing the system. That I had to understand that I need to understand the system and how it works and the policy and how we might be able to change the system. But there's an unrealistic expectation, and always has been, that what
number do you?
Do with education inside the school building.
Yes.
That what we send kids to school, they have lived for 4 or 5 years before getting there, and they come with that body of knowledge or without it. And then we expect the people in the classroom to churn out a finished product. But if you've got a kid coming to you who is coming for the first time and never had a stable home, you know, that they lived in shelters throughout much of the time, that you're not gonna, you have to deal differently with that kid than if you had someone coming from a home where they've been, you know, a stable home where they've been fed well every day, the house, and they had many other amenities to come along with them. And they are ready to learn when they get there because they know something already, you know, and you're building on that knowledge base. And what you offer, we often get with poor kids and kids, and many of the kids from the inner city, is that they come there a blank page that they bring in terms of knowledge, bring very little. That people in that household do not engage them in conversation. That they have learned to respond. They talk in directives, you know, do this, don't do that, stop this, stop that. And we expect well-polished behavior when the kids come into school. We do not invest enough, really, in our education that in order to get what we're looking for. And we don't always have the right leadership in place. And so what I tried to do was to take advantage of the 1 or 2 opportunities that would pop up during my tenure on the school board where I thought I could make a difference, and then say something about that and deal with it.
I have a question, and I also want to ask a question on behalf of Pat.
Paul, can I just follow up?
Well, I'm sorry, sure, go ahead, Dan.
You said we don't invest enough in our education. Is money the answer? I mean, I think it's $20,000 per kid in Minneapolis.
Well, no, when I said don't invest enough, I'm not talking about the dollars here. I'm talking about we don't invest enough time, you know, that and then we expect people who do not have the tools that they need to solve problems for which their tools that they have are ill-equipped to solve. You know, we can't expect the schools to provide housing and clothing for our kids, and but yet, we send them to school anyway, and then we haven't, I don't know that we necessarily know what we want from our schools. And the plan that I had that never got to the table was that I wanted to begin by creating a demonstration project. Let's say take one school, and that we would go into that school and we would assess what resources they had, what they had there. We would also look at the community in which the school is located. We would assess what's available there. We would bring these two together and have each one share with the other what it is that I bring to the table, and understand whose role is what, that teachers, what it is that teachers are supposed to do, what it is that parents and guardians are supposed to do, what it is that the community itself is supposed to do. And that we know that and we also know what the schools are best at. If you deliver the child to them, clothed, not hungry, not sick, and fairly stable mental health, that we can have tremendous expectations from them in terms of teaching side of it. We can hold them accountable for that. But if we
maybe there's a segue there, and I hate to cut the answer short, but I fear we're going to run out of time here.
Yeah, because
but maybe my segue from that would be, this is maybe simplistic in terms of how to look at things. It seems to me that the work you did in the mid-60s was very practical. How do we lift this community up economically? How do we provide healthcare and childcare? How do we create the type of institutional framework that's going to provide people that live in North Minneapolis with the support they need for a better life, to really address those inequality issues? It seems as though, and obviously this is a very important thing right now, that many of us, myself certainly included, have had this profound ignorance on issues of race. And there's an awakening that's happening as a consequence of that. And certainly as it relates to policing, but it almost seems like the efforts now are more, I'm probably not going to ask this question the best way, but it seems as though our efforts now are more at getting those issues of institutional racism or even individual racism, white ignorance and white privilege, all of those things which certainly need to be confronted. But it seems as though there's not the practical. It seems as though we're not having those discussions as much as you were having about how we actually lift people out of poverty, and maybe I'm not being fair, but it seems like that's a bit of a difference between the two times.
Yeah, well, I think that we are more, in many ways, we focus not enough time on what we can do together. And a lot of it is around what has been generated on the national scene politically, and where in this whole movement to demonize people with certain characteristics, and we focus more on who you are and what you look like and what you believe, and how you love or not love one another. And those become the issues that divide us. And instead of looking at how we can coalesce together around things that need to get done, and we really don't communicate with one another, particularly across we are in our little cul-de-sacs, and if you're not in that cul-de-sac, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And if you don't think and believe the same way I do, that's it. And I think some of that can be attributed to the tremendous expansion in communication, in the way we communicate with one another, and that we can instantly demonize an individual by the click of a button and post something on, on the internet. And whereas one of the things that we had to do in the 60s is to come together and see one another, see who was saying and doing what. And I think much of it really is going to
This has been
the kind of leadership that we have.
yeah.
So Pat has a question. I have a question. Pat, Lyndon, and Tom, and then we're going to wrap things up. Pat, go ahead.
I want to ask because I think your answer is going to be very significant, but how important was the Star Tribune at that time, and how supportive were they of you?
Well, it was a different newspaper then. You could access them. You could go down, you could talk to people. One of the things that the Star did, and because the criticism, I remember both the Star and the Tribune that one time if I read something I didn't like, I didn't think it came out the right way, in addition to writing to the editor, I could pick up the telephone and call, and you could get somebody to talk to. I've tried several times to be able to talk to the current editor of the Star Tribune, and I never have. What they will do is I'll get an email back or some response from someone else, because that person is too important for me to talk to. And I think that one of the things that used to happen then is that when a new staff reporter came on board, if that person came out into the community and met some people that and began to learn something, so that it was a different thing. I think they could play a greater role than they are now by getting to know. One of the things that I wanted to say to the current editor is that when you bring your people in, and one of the things they ought to do is to research the history, and learn something about what's happened in the community the last 15, 20 years. If you're going to write about issues of social justice, civil rights, anything like that, you've got to go back at least 50 years and look at what was going on in the community then and compare it to what is happening now. So that and trying to get through to a real lot of it. I get frustrated every time I go online that I can't talk to them. They tell me to go online to take care of a problem. And when I know that I cannot explain myself online, but I can if I'm talking to you face to face.
Thank you.
Great. Lyndon, and then Tom, and then we'll let you wrap up with any final words you have.
Yeah, maybe I'll just limit to mine to more of a comment if he has time to respond. But what I was picking up on with some of the discussion was some of the other social issues that the schools have to deal with. And one that came to mind a while back, I had a meeting when I was still in the legislature. In fact, at the time I was chairing the education committee with the superintendents of Osseo, Brooklyn Center, Robbinsdale, and Minneapolis to see if there was some way we could resolve the mobility problem. Students that would be temporarily in one school district, a few days later in another school district, and then sometimes a third, and then sometimes even coming back. And I understood full well what they were saying as a teacher at the time at Edison, because in that area, I would have students that would be in Minneapolis at Edison, then they'd be up in Fridley, then Coon Rapids, back in Edison. And my point is that some of these other issues like housing stability play such an important role in terms of creating stability within the educational community. We even looked into the idea of a virtual school district for some at the time, but I'll just stop there. And if Mr. Williams has
I agree.
and otherwise I know our time is limited.
No, I agree. That's why I said that it's not solely a school problem, that we have to coordinate the housing along with it, because if people don't have stable housing, they can't get to school. And this whole thing of it's a real challenge, And it's going to really boil down to having the kind of leadership that is dedicated to these kinds of issues that can begin to work with them. And it almost, I think, has to be come to the form of what I would call a movement, where that you have enough people that are dedicated to resolving a particular issue and something gets done about it. And I think we are beginning to see some of that going to happen in relation to the police thing because of the crisis of George Floyd. And we'll have to see what kind of continuity comes from that and what will be the quality of the leadership that is dedicated to getting something done there.
Tom, we'll give you the last question.
Thank you. T, I'm very, very impressed with what you've done, especially as in relationship to Paul's last remarks and now Lyndon's. The 60s and 70s had a community sensitivity to solving a problem. It did not depend on whether you were an expert in X, Y, or Z. It was the team working together formally and informally. We see that across the US in some interesting examples, such as Geoffrey Canada's work in New York, which I'm sure you're familiar with, or DNSI in Boston, which are full community working across disciplines, working across areas of expertise. And watching what's happening in Minneapolis and Saint Paul, and my most recent experience with Upper Harbor terminal problems and what they're trying to do, as well as what's happening in South Minneapolis, is that we have reverted in Minnesota to a disciplinary orientation. We've fragmented the working across disciplines, working across agencies, each one having its own territory rather than seeing the commonality. I don't know how to break that, those silos. The interesting piece that was you had posted regarding the study of problems within the schools, again, is a perfect example of having to reduce and eliminate all the pieces to try to find the one piece which you wanted to test. That's an academic approach to it, and that's how the problems are being solved in the school systems right now. As you've just mentioned, housing, counseling, all these things are in separate agencies. It's hard to get them to collaborate because of budgets and other political issues. And I don't know how to break that fragmentation and siloing.
So that's your question to end on. We'll give you a chance. How do you do that?
Yeah, well,
you can comment on that, T, and then we'll let you make any final comments.
Yeah, it's, we always seem to think, and I have to check myself sometime on this, is that what we are experiencing now is the worst, and that we did it so much better 50 years ago. I hope that, my comments, I have not intended to say that what we did then was it was better than what we're doing now, because we respond to the circumstances of the time. But it was different. The thing that bothers me most about is that how reluctant we are to take a critical look at experiences we've had before for opportunities to learn from those experiences and to see how we can use that learning to address some of the things that we are faced with today. And the quickness sometimes to dismiss the ideas because they didn't come from you, and also to just tend to dismiss them because they may be not a part of your generation. So that you don't, things are different now than they were then. You don't quite understand. And I guess the final thing I want to say and close it out of this, because I've got to get out of here myself, is that I don't think we pay enough attention to building strong institutions, because our institutions are so important. And the thing that bothers me also is that we have too many people, especially at the national level, and some of it at the state and local level, who do not believe in the missions of their institutions. And that although they may be heading them, they're working hard to tear them down. So they're not to stabilize them or build them up, but they do not believe in the mission. So, and when that, and what's concerned is when they move on, and they will move on, they have no choice to move on, that they are leaving a very tough job for their successors, because we got nothing done if there isn't credibility. You know, I was successful as the ombudsman because of the credibility, because I didn't have the authority to make anyone do anything. They had to believe in the reasonableness of my recommendations to them, and the fact that I'd been thorough in my investigations and that I could support it. And so that I see the deterioration of very important institutions. And I would really like to see us, find some ways to focus on the building up and the strengthening of our critical institutions, because they are the mediating forces of our community. Without them, we no longer have any soft landings. They're all rough landings. And,
Thanks, T. I think one of the central premises of the Civic Caucus is that history still matters.
Yeah, it does. It really does. And I think that's important. And I want to thank all of you for listening to my ramblings, and I appreciate that and the questions that you pose. And I look forward to doing this again sometime.